So the question that we're going to be looking at today is, how can I use compelling and supporting questions to frame and focus learning? And then this happened, and now turn to page, and now you do this step, has literally been uttered by virtually every teacher since the dawn of time. And this is sort of where we're beginning, is that sort of the opposite of what we're expecting when it comes to using questions in a classroom. So we're going to actually be joined on our journey today by one of my favorite characters in all of literary history, Alice from Alice in Wonderland. Because she went on a journey, as we are about to, we're going to use her frame of mind as a way of thinking about this. Alice is oftentimes the way that I sort of used how kids might see the world. It's confusing, it's conflicting, authority that makes no sense, people who seem good at the beginning are bad at the end, and so on. So we're trying to figure out how to help students navigate that world. So a journey of inquiry is bound to lead you into the unknown, as it should. But if you have a sense of the kinds of questions to ask at various stages along the way, you've at least got some road markers. Indeed, this is the beauty of process in general. It may not provide any answers or solutions, but having a process helps you to keep taking steps. So during Alice's journey in Wonderland, she encounters the Cheshire Cat. She asks the question, trying to figure out where she is. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? The cat says that depends a good deal on where you want to go. Alice, not really knowing, says, I don't really care. The cat says, well, then it doesn't matter which way you go. And I think this is a really telling understanding of where and what we do in the classroom matters. Questions can actually give you a big understanding of what you might do, but if you don't know what kind of questions to ask, then you are literally at a place, at a fork in the road, not having the skill, knowledge, dispositions, or experiences to lead you down one path or the other. So thinking then begins in a forked road situation, much in the same way as it applies to Alice, which is ambiguous, which presents a dilemma, which proposes alternatives. Where there is no question of a problem to be solved or a difficulty to be surmounted, the course of suggestion flows on at random, much in the same way as we began the slides. And then this happened. But a question to be answered, an ambiguity to be resolved, sets up an end and holds the current of ideas to a definite channel, meaning that questions help us frame and focus where it is we ought to go. Thinking is not a case of spontaneous combustion. There is something specific which occasions and evokes it. And oftentimes what evokes it are these two major questions for our students. We cannot just throw them into Wonderland. They have to navigate very complex things in their own life. But oftentimes, between the question of where the student is and where the student is going, there's an enormous gap. We call these curiosity gaps. We don't know how to fill these curiosity gaps necessarily because we can't, again, throw the kids into Wonderland. So oftentimes in a classroom, we have to manufacture these curiosity gaps. To help manufacture those curiosity gaps, we use compelling questions, which are very different than essential questions. I won't go into it here, but you're happy to email me. We're putting together a one-pager about the difference between a compelling and essential. We're not trying to add new jargon to teachers' understanding. This really comes from the C3 framework and the understanding that a compelling question does very specific things, which we're going to go into, and that essential questions have become understood as essential maybe to the discipline or to a large overview that's really not necessarily in the purview of our students. Again, I won't go into that here, but I am going to go deeper into compelling question, which does something that the essential questions don't do. Compelling questions are specifically designed with two things in mind. One is making space from the lived experiences of the learners. The second is making space, equal space, with the standards that need to be taught. This is my daughter, fourth grader at Bowen Elementary, who can use compelling questions, right? And see those compelling questions in by both this sort of windows and mirrors example. The compelling question becomes a window for opportunity to understand where they might go and understanding those curiosity gaps. The compelling questions are also constructed as a way of reflecting of what they've gone through and how that experience can actually impact the learning when shared with others in the classroom. On the other side of the coin, we have the state standards that have all these different contents that need to be taught, and that these ultimately interweave in the minds of the child, right? Only in education do we typically silo these ideas, where oftentimes we don't wake up and say, you know what, I've got an art problem today, or I've got a science problem today. But it is important to understand the lenses and the skills that come with each of those subject matters. So compelling questions then create gaps that challenge students' assumptions and spark the need and desire to make sense of the world as it relates to them. That's key. Disciplines are lenses that complicate the world. The goal of education is not to simplify the complex, but to make the complex accessible. Compelling questions help us do this. So we've got our compelling question funnel here, in which we drop in all the different subject matters. We churn these things up with compelling questions, and out pop two different types of learning. One is intradisciplinary learning, meaning with among the disciplines, right? The other is inter, meaning between the disciplines. Compelling questions are great for within social studies, but they can also be interdisciplinary, right, across the board. So what then are compelling and one that we haven't talked about, supporting questions? So compelling questions have very specific definitions. The first of which we've already looked at is that they're meant to manufacture that curiosity. The other that we've talked about briefly with my daughter is that they're both intellectually rigorous and student friendly, right? That student friendliness means that they're also being relevant to their lives. So we're looking for questions that students can hold in their heads. We're going to see some examples in just a second. Compelling questions help us frame the learning for units and years. And because they help us frame that, that means that they are not just ornamental. Oftentimes, essential questions are never actually answered inside of the classroom. That is not the case with compelling questions. Compelling questions are actually bookended by summative performance tasks that close out that unit. Within the social studies, the intradisciplinary, we have that compelling questions do specific things. That's going to change based upon the subject matter that you have. My wife is a chemistry teacher at Atherton High School, and she's been able to use compelling questions within science. But because NGSS demands that models are created, her end task is different than what it's going to be in social studies. For social studies, our end tasks are always argumentative, meaning that there's multiple viewpoints. Compelling questions are meant to be subjective. That's what gives them the open-endedness so that students' lived experiences can enter into the conversation. Argumentative here does not mean controversial to the core. It means that a student must answer a compelling question with evidence, that they must bear the responsibility, the burden of proof, of proving that which they say is true. Compelling questions in social studies, and I think across all disciplines, reflect the realities of the social world. These are not made-up questions. These are ones that can be answered with investigation. That they also encompass multiple perspectives, and that they challenge the status quo and power relationships and the social constructs that we've created. Additionally, these can be interdisciplinary between the different disciplines, and we'll give some examples of that in just a second. So at the heart of what we just talked about, a compelling question means that I've mentioned several times that the learner is the center of this, that you have them in mind, which brings to bear the responsibility we have as teachers and educators to make sure that we have good, solid relationships and that we know our kids and their lives well. Without that, it's difficult to do the next step. My daughter and I have had a lot of conversations over this past year. These are typically the questions in some form or fashion that we've investigated, not in a sense where we sit down and look at these questions. These are the types of things that she brings to me. So what we've tried to do is use those types of questions to build out a curriculum, to use this where the student is and what they're interested in, and trying to combine it with the very difficult, by the way, 1400 to 1700 in the Americas standards which accompany my daughter in the fourth grade. So if we look at a few of these, do people grow up the same? We might translate that into a much larger question of how does where you live influence how you live? Or for example, am I safe? What does it take to survive? What is fair? Does trade make everyone better off? How do you understand another person? How does perspective build empathy? So we've taken the ideas of what might be, in a very general way, something that is always sort of on the minds of 9 and 10-year-olds, and we've transformed those into a curriculum that's guided, framed, and focused by these compelling questions. I mentioned earlier that there's a combination between student friendliness and intellectual rigor, but these are not always 50-50. Sometimes they're more student friendly. That's usually the case in elementary and maybe middle school, or even beginning of the first units in high school. As you move along, sometimes it's actually more intellectually rigorous than it is student friendly. Sometimes these are more middle and high, the ending units in elementary, or even content specific. Something like monetary policy is very difficult to do in a student friendly way, but it's something that is 100% needed for our electorate. So what you might see is that, some of these compelling questions are not going to be as compelling as others. That's going to be true. So the idea then is that all that represents is that we all have our own preferences. And so it's never a one size fits all, but we're always opening this up for students to be able to give their interpretations of that question. So we'll see a balance between the student friendly and intellectually rigorous. The very top left, Will a Mountain Last Forever, actually comes from a fourth grade inquiry that a fourth grade teacher in Boyle County developed. Will a mountain last forever? You can see that's very student friendly. That's a question that can really, that a student can hold in their heads, because they're going to think about, well, why wouldn't it last forever? And you start to get into your mind. Another example of that, how much does my PlayStation cost? An example of a sixth grade inquiry that was done, where you're actually looking at saving versus interest rates. And finally, a high school example, which is more intellectually rigorous and student friendly, was the New Deal a good deal? That opens up a lot of questions about, well, what do you mean by a good deal? Who's a good deal for, and so on. So as you can sort of see, that this is sort of going across the map. Now, what I will say is that, how does where we live affect how we live? We've used that question both in the third grade and in high school, because it has such a very much of a powerful kind of question that it's both student friendly and intellectually rigorous, and that we can see that over different years. When it comes to supporting questions, these are much more concrete. If compelling questions are more open-ended, supporting questions are more closed. These are the knowns in the discipline which essentially connect the standards to the compelling question. Oftentimes people will say, well, the compelling question, it sort of seems like anything goes if it's so open-ended. That's not true. You have to be able to prove things, and by that investigation, you're grounding the investigation in those supporting questions. These typically begin with the what, the who, the where, the when, whatever it is that typically closes those gaps, that gives us some facts that we can typically agree upon, even if there's some discrepancies within those agreements. Just as compelling questions help answer and are bookended at the end of a unit by a submitted performance task, so too are supporting questions bookended by formative performance tasks, that these work in tandem. Again, supporting questions are not ornamental, but are literally what students are going to be doing day in and day out. Another thing about supporting questions is that the language determines the depth of content. If supporting questions help you build to compelling question, well, what helps supporting questions? Well, other supporting questions. So let's take a look at how these might exist at a large level or even a small level. That the language that you use in your questions determines the size of the learning that's going to take place. Both are necessary for our students. So in a unit like how does belief influence action, you might have a macro question, this large question that might appear at the very front of that unit that helps sort of lay a groundscape, much like the opening scenes of a movie to establish the tone and the characters or exposition. For the macro side, how did reformers attempt to change society? Well, these are really about laying the groundwork. We could talk about abolitionists here. We could talk about women's rights issues here. We could talk about prison reform or education. But let's say that we really want to focus even further on one of those types. We might look at how women challenged authority, or we might even look specifically at a single individual who did that. Again, a lot of variance when it comes to the types of supporting questions that you use. So what is then the relationship between the compelling and supporting questions? This is another key difference between essential. Essential questions typically can't be scaffolded. They just are what they are. Compelling and supporting questions work in tandem. You cannot have one without the other. Let me repeat that. You cannot have one without the other. Compelling questions without supporting questions are going to lead to anything goes. Supporting questions without compelling questions are dreadfully boring and are detached from both the lived experiences of students and the context of why that question matters. So a compelling question then is really the frame and focus of a unit. The supporting questions are the frame and focus of a lesson. That if compelling questions are the motivation, supporting questions are the means. What good is a roof without walls? What good is a stool without legs? What good is a compelling question without supporting questions? That's the metaphor here. So a few examples. What drives you to the polls? We could talk ad nauseum about this, but really the supporting question helps ground us into the knowns. Well, what are my political beliefs? That might give me some indication of how I might vote. Is nuclear power worth the risks? Well, depending on how you answer that is going to depend upon where nuclear reactors are located. And what does it take to survive? Well, what rules or laws help overcome challenges? Please note these are just one example of a supporting question, but there would be actually multiple supporting questions helping us guide towards the compelling. So how are these bookended by task? This is something I mentioned previously. Well, we all know that supporting questions help support the compelling question in the same way that formative performance tasks are helping build the skills necessary to complete the summative performance task. But we also know that these are bookended together. Compelling questions relate to the summative performance task in the same way that supporting questions relate to the formative performance task. What I've oftentimes likened this to is a Tootsie Roll. The twist on either side of the candy are the compelling or the summative performance task. The questions and the task, they keep everything tightly there. What's in between that, the discussions, the rich understandings of the text and sources you might use, that's the good stuff, right? But if we don't have one of those two sides twisted around, we actually lose the good stuff as it falls away. So if questions then are the engines of intellect, cerebral machines that convert curiosity into controlled inquiry, we have to figure out how to scaffold these questions to help student learners. In social studies, this is one way we've done this. Compelling questions at the very top, again, bookended by the supporting summative performance task. You can see then that supporting questions, multiple ones, typically we do 9 for our units in social studies, but you can do as few as 1 or even 2. These will help build and scaffold towards a compelling question. Simultaneously, how do we backwards plan from that summative performance task for those formative performance tasks that align to those questions? If the summative performance task is about speaking, then the formative performance task should help those students build the skills necessary to be successful in that summative task. And obviously we have sources or texts and discussions along the way. An example within our frameworks, this is from 8th grade. How did racist policies divide the country? You can see that's what's framing this entire bit. We have only 4 supporting questions here, but there's a total of 9. And you can sort of see the different sizes of those supporting and supporting questions. Number 2 is very macro. Number 3 is more micro. An example of how you might do this in choice boards, something that's been pretty popular here. Suzanne Kramer and I did a presentation about this a couple weeks ago where we actually used the compelling question as the focus point of that board, and that the supporting questions actually embody the different types of standards that students would encounter. An example of this of what might look like at a 5th grade, a high school example of this, focusing on the coronavirus. And actually this is one from the AIC, Shelley Scott at J-Town Elementary, that she was working on that sort of uses these questions. So this is actually one that was just created. She just sent this to me again with a follow-up yesterday. And so this is like hot off the press. So if you want this, I'm more than happy. And she said that we could share it far and wide. So this is just an example of what that interdisciplinary choice board might look like for elementary in the 3rd grade. So what should I consider when developing a compelling question? Not necessarily about supporting, but definitely a compelling. Number 1 is that it takes time and is super messy. The only way that we really know if a compelling question works is whenever we actually start to teach it. That's not necessarily 100% true. There's a few things I'm going to show you in a second, but ultimately it depends on what the students see. which is why we have to make sure that we have them in mind when first crafting it, knowing full well that that compelling question can shift and change based upon its interactions with students. There's been time in my own teaching where I've used compelling questions for one class that is different than a compelling question from another class, even though they're the exact same U.S. history class. It all has to do with the students who are in there. Here's the different ways of actually framing and focusing and using the language to shape those questions. I won't go into much of it here and here's another set of this because you guys have the power of pause and you guys have access to this PowerPoint. When it comes to the thought process of creating one, I highly recommend that if you're looking at balancing the kid friendliness and the intellectual rigor, that you start with the intellectual rigor. What we've noticed when coming up with questions is if you try to start off with the kid friendly, they become too kitschy. And it presents problems later on. So this is an example that my wife and I did about nuclear energy. We first start off with this question here. And we said, well, that's too big. So let's narrow this down to nuclear energy impacts us. What do we mean by impact? That's not exactly, descriptive of any way. How does nuclear energy help us? So you can sort of see that we're sort of wrestling with the relationship between nuclear energy and human beings. And ultimately, we decided upon this question, is nuclear power worth the risks? The worth the risk part depends on what you mean by risk, what do you mean by worth, and where are these things located. Oftentimes we say something that may not be true, what makes a question bad? That there's not a lot of bad questions that exist. There's a lot of bad questions, and I'm about to show you a few. When it comes to compelling questions, some of the concerns is that they're not real, that they lead to a quote-unquote right answer, which makes for disingenuous learning, that they're superficial or one-sided, that they're conspiratorial or unfounded, or that they're morally reprehensible. A few examples over on the side here embody some of these concerns. The very first one is actually one that's quite controversial because a lot of teachers, myself, have used this question. So I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm just here to expose and consider what kind of questions that we're using to frame our learning. Was Columbus a hero or a villain? This is a very binary understanding of a very complex human being. It doesn't take necessarily into account a lot of the lived experience of the person, not to mention Columbus died in a debtor prison, right? And has a legacy of cutting people's hands off and, in order to find gold. Not exactly how I would define a hero, but making kids choose one or the other seems disingenuous. I would never want to be put on such a binary scale, and neither should Columbus. Is slavery justified? Ugh. Was Hitler a good leader? Maybe a good fascist, but if we're going to use good leader in the sense of whatever, imagine these two questions being argued. My daughter has to come home and say, Dad, today I argued about why slavery is justified. Imagine then me getting back into my car and driving back to the school and asking the question, why in the world would you have my child defend slavery? Have we learned no lessons? Or was 9/11 an inside job? We're not even going to touch it, right? Please don't ask these kind of questions and frame the learning around them. They are destructive, and the technical term for that is curriculum violence. Supporting questions have the same kind of concerns. Sometimes they fail to align to the compelling question, or they're superficial, or more importantly, they reinforce oppressive interpretations by typically including only one perspective. These two, again, all these questions are real that teachers have come up with to try to focus their learning either in professional learnings that I've done or from, for example, the second question there, was the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II justified or an unfortunate setback for democracy? Disgusting question. That question comes from Gilder Lehrman, which is oftentimes held up as the premier social studies group. That's a very destructive question and takes into consideration not the point of view of Japanese Americans, but white leaders who were leading at the time. Was Dr. King or Malcolm X better representing? Why do we have to compare two individuals who are super complex? Again, we want to keep the complexity there. A better question is looking at how their ideas change over time based upon those contexts. Why? Because students' ideas change over time, and they're better able to relate to these figures who were living in very, very difficult times. Please don't do these either. These are what make questions quality. What I've done here, and I won't go into today because of time, is literally just essentially redouble what was said at the very beginning, putting it in one slide, giving an example color-coded from examples of compelling questions at the top and how they respond to the supporting questions below. Finally, The last way that you can make sure that a question, and by the way, notice here in the previous slide that I put what makes a question quality, not good. Oftentimes teachers get in this mindset that they've got to have the right question, the good question. Please don't fall into that trap. The reason being is that just as the question has to be quality enough to enter into the conversation, knowing full well that it will be sculpted by the instruction and by the students in your class or by peers who are helping create it in the PLC. What are some examples of stress testing? This is making sure that your compelling question can survive inside of a classroom by first testing what are possible answers that students could come up with. It doesn't have to be an exhaustive list, just making sure that the question is valid enough for inquiry. Conflict is difficult to resolve because, well, there's often deep-seated historical events, or there's economic inequality, or there's polarized religious beliefs. Each of these things create a different way of exploring. And by the way, when you stress test this way, these are called argument stems, which are basically thesis statements. They actually help you figure out which direction you might go with supporting questions. All that to say, questions are more relevant than answers. Questions are bigger than answers. One good question can give rise to several layers of answers, can inspire decades-long searches for solutions, can generate whole new fields of inquiry, and can prompt changes in entrenched thinking. Answers, on the other hand, often end that process. And that is why we must use questions to frame and focus our learning. Here's some additional reading if you would like to look into it. They're linked in. I've put in yellow there the ones that you might want to begin with. If you have any questions or concerns or want us to overlook choice boards when using questions, we're more happy to do so.
Well, Ryan, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for presenting. And I think you guys have done this every day this week, or maybe you did every day. And it's just, Heather Worrell said in the chat, like, she's seen this 5 times and she just can't get enough of it. And I agree. I said the other day in the chat that it makes me realize how bad of a questioner I was when I was still in the classroom. So I really appreciate it.
I appreciate that compliment. And what I will say is that it's great to be reflective in that way, but we're all still learning in that process. And trust me, even looking at the curriculum that we've done, there's a lot of questions that we have that are super bad. And in fact, we're continuously improving those questions over time. So don't get down on yourself, right? We're not working this. We're just saying that questions are good, and that by focusing on the questions, it really does reveal quite a bit about us.
No, I love it. Thank you all so much for this awesome work all week long. I hope you guys have a great weekend.
Yep, you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.